joining our session today. My name is Rhonda Campbell Duggan. I'm a nephrology nurse and currently employed by Fresenius Medical Care.
And I'm Susan Walker. I am also a nurse and I work as the territory manager for Untitled Vascular Care here in Charlotte.
Well, together we are going to talk about kidney donation, and we're going to take you through the journey of a living kidney donor. So first things first, though, is that we do have to talk a little bit about a disclosure for both of us. And as we go through our session today, I want to be sure that by the end of it, that you are able to identify current data regarding kidney transplantation, as well as the survival for both the graft, or otherwise known as the kidney, as well as patient survival. And then we're going to take a look at the long-term outcomes for the living donor. We also want to look into the goals of living donation so that you'll be able to describe what those goals are, including the risk, the benefits, and any potential barriers that a living donor may experience. And as I said, we're really excited to be able to share the journey of a living donor. So I'm sure you're probably asking, what in the world do we have this football stadium up on the screen for? Well, Susan and I are both from Charlotte, and so we wanted to kind of get back to our roots a little bit. And if you're anything like me in terms of education and learning, I'm such a visual learner. And what I thought it would be great to do is kind of bring a number into perspective. So as we go through the presentation today, we're going to look at a lot of data points and a lot of numbers. And what I want you to do is really keep in mind this image. So this is the Bank of America Stadium in Charlotte, the home of the Panthers. What we know is that the seating capacity for the Bank of America Stadium is over 73,000. So again, I'm a visual learner, so I want you to keep this visual image in your mind as we go through. So according to SRTR, we know that today there are over 108,000 patients that are waiting on a life-saving organ transplant. And of those numbers, we know that nearly 92,000 of those are waiting on a kidney. So we also know that the supply and the demand just doesn't equal. We just don't have enough deceased donors to meet that growing need. We know that the numbers are definitely increasing of transplants that have been performed, but we need to figure out a way that we can break down that barrier and we can really find a way to better serve those who are in need of a kidney. So remember that visual that I talked about. Let's bring that back up. So the Panthers Stadium holds over 73,000 people. But when we think about that in contrast to those that are waiting on a kidney, where it's nearly 92,000, we would absolutely fill this stadium up and even have some that can't get in there. So to me, I think that's huge. We need to find ways that we can impact that number, no doubt. So looking at the waiting list itself, what's important to think about when we think about those that are waiting on a kidney is, really, how are they doing? How are we doing with making an impact to the list? And what we know is based on waiting time. Now, waiting time is determined a couple different ways. It's based on either the first day of chronic dialysis or it's when you're added to the waiting list. So really, whichever comes first. So the image here on the left that talks about time on dialysis, you can see that there are, the numbers are really varied across the board. And then if we look at the graph on the right, we look at the time since listing, and we can see that the numbers are increasing, but the number of those being added to the wait list is also increasing. So I think important for us to think about today is what's the impact of living donation in terms of the overall benefit to the recipients. So when we look at these two different graphs here, we want to compare the graft survival. Remember, graft is kidney. So when we look at this, the graft failure among those receiving a kidney from a deceased donor and graft failure from those receiving a living donor transplant. What we know is that those receiving a kidney from a live donor do so much better. The long-term graft survival is so much greater, with a post-transplant survival at that 3-year mark of 98% survival. So that's huge in terms of living donation. So the goal really would be to be able to have more people, more patients waiting for a kidney to have access to a living donor. So let's step back a second and let's talk about really what are the types of donors that patients who are in need of this life-saving gift, what are those types of donors? So typically, most everyone thinks of a deceased donor. And when we break that down a little bit further, what we know is that the deceased donor, there's actually some different categories. One is the standard donor, and then there are some other unique categories that the recipient, based on their individual need, could choose to be listed for. Now, the other option is for a living donor. And again, most common people think that the living donor has to be someone who is a blood relative. But in reality, this actually could be someone who has no blood relation at all. It could be someone that knows the recipient. Maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's someone who is an altruistic donor, or someone who wants to just give the gift of life because they know that there's a greater need. So we have a lot of options, again, based on the recipient's unique need. And when we think about living donation, we've looked at some data, we've looked at statistics, we've looked at the numbers of those waiting. We want to go back to really thinking about what's the overall goal of living donation. So for the recipient, we know that we want that time on dialysis to be as low as it can be. We know the effects of dialysis, the effects of chronic kidney disease on the patient. And so the shorter the waiting time to receive a transplant, the better. We know that the shorter the waiting time, we're able to maximize that overall benefit for the recipient and also having minimal risk to the living donor. As I just mentioned, we know that the overall long-term success rates for the recipient are greater when receiving a living donor transplant. And then when we talk about the actual recovery process of the organ, the time that the organ is without blood flow, the lower the time it goes without blood flow, the greater chance of survival and the least risk of delayed graft function. So again, lower cold ischemic time, or the time without blood flow, the lower the risk of a delay in that kidney or the graft actually functioning, the better the long-term benefit there is to that recipient. So again, a lot of really great goals for living donation. Now, we've talked about the benefits of living donation, but how does someone go about making the decision to become a living donor? You know, it's a little bit more than just deciding what outfit to wear for the day. It's a lifelong commitment to this living donor. So, Susan, this is where I want to have you jump in and talk a little bit about how does someone go about making this decision?
Right. So, there are certainly a lot of folks who make the decision because they are related. It's their son, it's their dad, or their friends or their spouse. The decision-making for me was a little bit different. So I have worked as a part of the vascular access world for about 10 years. And so taking care of patients who are actively on dialysis, keeping them running so that they can receive their dialysis. And so over the course of those years, it just sort of, it kind of came to me maybe a couple years ago as I learned more and more. And then, so probably about 2 years ago, I started really seriously thinking about, wow, this is maybe something that I want to do. And I spoke to my husband about it. My children are grown, and I don't have family who has kidney failure. I don't know anyone who needs a kidney. And so for me, it was just sort of learning and kind of wrapping my head around such a big decision. I think the day that I really decided was I was in the center, and we had a young man, mid-30s, on the procedure table, and he was talking with the nurse in the room about dialysis and how that was going for him. And he made the comment, but I'm on the list. I'm on the list. And the hope that I heard in his voice was just inspiring. And that was, for me, the day that I went home and I told my husband that this was something that I wanted to do. So this was the summer, last summer I did this, made that decision. And so the first step was getting educated. And so, my decision was the decision to start asking questions, the decision to learn about it. So I reached out to my local transplant center and had a conversation with the coordinator, lengthy conversation with her. And she sent out a packet of information for me to complete. And that was kind of how it got started.
Wow. I can't even imagine what it was like you thought about it, and then you said, okay, let me jump into this a little bit more. So that to me is incredible. So we've started hearing a little bit about Susan's journey. So let's talk about who are those people that are actually donating. Who are the live donors? When we look at the donors, and again, this data comes from the Transplant Registry, and it's an annual report that they put out. So when we look at the donors, you can see that the average age of a living donor is 35 to 49, with the next highest group between 50 and 64. And then when we look at other data points, we see that the majority of living donors are women. And then when we look at broken down by race, we see that Caucasians, followed by Hispanic, and then followed by African Americans. So again, we have a lot of different groups of people that are donating. And then I think what's really neat for me is to look at those that are donating by the relationship. So the most common, as we've just talked about, are those that have an intended recipient. But when you look at this data set again, even closer, you see those that are living, but they're giving to an intended recipient that they're not blood related to. And I think that's huge. And then we start to look at the altruistic donors, such as Susan, and those going into the kidney paired exchange program. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go. So when someone makes that decision and they start to think about this and they start to become educated, I know there have to be barriers out there. And I can only imagine that there's some fear. There's the fact that someone could be told that they're not suitable, they're medically unsuitable to donate, or maybe that they're incompatible. So I'm sure that with education, some of that can go away. And I know personally, having been a living donor coordinator for many years, I saw that, I heard that, and was able to help talk through some of that with my patients. So Susan, what was that like for you?
Mm-hmm. Fear was real. There was so much that was unknown, but I was willing and wanting to be educated. And certainly the education that I received really allayed the fears that I had, that I was able to understand that, the likelihood of my developing end-stage renal disease was minimal. And so really education that was provided through the evaluation process was absolutely invaluable to me. Being medically unsuitable, I kind of figured that I would just make myself available. And if I wasn't a match, then it just wouldn't work out. And I was kind of okay with that. The financial implications, I think, can be really real for people. And it's certainly something that I really wanted to understand. My husband and I are approaching retirement, and I didn't want to make a decision that would negatively impact his future. So I wanted to understand what the cost was. So it was was a relief to know that there was no financial cost to me. Everything that I went through to be evaluated and surgery and post-op and then continuing to follow me for some time after surgery, that's covered by the recipient's insurance company. So there have been no financial cost to me other than just my time out of work. Other than that, there was no financial cost. So really the barriers for me were really allayed by education and learning about it and understanding.
That's great. Yeah, I think back to some instances when I would work with a potential donor and unfortunately we found that they were medically unsuitable. They had their heart set on being able to help someone. And what I would always tell them was, had they not wanted to do this and thought about doing this to give the gift of life, they came forward, they were evaluated. And in actuality, that might have actually saved their life because, we may, if we found something that could be addressed, corrected, or, monitored, then really they almost saved their own life by wanting to save and give to someone else. So it's kind of all, like you said, it's education. It's how we put it into perspective for the person who's stepping forward. Now, I know that there's organizations out there that have also recognized that there's barriers that exist. I know the National Kidney Foundation, they've got an initiative out there called the Big Ask and the Big Give. And it's huge. I think that it's great that we're seeing organizations such as this one. We've also seen a program called the Living Donor Protection Act, so that it protects donors in the event of anything long-term from insurance, from financial scenarios and so forth. So it's really good that, as you mentioned, there are options out there. So for you, were there programs that you became involved in as you were going through the process to help educate you?
Mm-hmm. There were. Probably the most important one for me, because so much of this was unknown. I had never, prior to this, I really had never had surgery. I'd never been in the hospital. So there was a lot of unknown. And we, in our transplant center, we have a mentorship program. So they connected me with folks that have been through this before. And one gentleman that I was connected with, he donated 5 years ago. He was also a non-directed donor like myself. And being able to talk to him and ask questions, and he was available to me through the whole process, that was invaluable to me.
Wow, that's great. That's great. And I think it's become a standard for a lot of transplant centers to offer that mentorship because, it's great for someone who wants to go through it to talk to someone who's walked the walk and been through that journey themselves. So I think that itself is fantastic. Now, before I mentioned that incompatibility was something that the living donor had to think about, but what I wanted to really talk about here was there's options out there. And so, Susan, for you, I'd love to hear what it was like for you going into this and how, how your blood type played a part into this and what created an option for other people.
Right. So I am blood type O positive, which makes me what we call the universal donor. So I can donate to any other blood type. Unfortunately, if you're a blood type O, you are not the universal recipient. And so you can only receive from an O. So because of that, O type blood folks tend to spend more time on the transplant list waiting for a match. And incidentally, my recipient, I was a part of that paired exchange, and it helped my recipient because her sister did not match her from a blood type perspective, and I did. So we were able to do a really great thing for her and for other people too.
That's exciting. And so this is part of the education too, when a recipient's going through the evaluation process themselves, is we want them to think bigger, think broader, and think about, let us kind of worry about, when I say us, the transplant team, kind of worry about the compatibility issues and things like that, because again, there are options, such as the paired exchange. So once you made the decision, you started talking about how to do this. The next it's the next, not really a stop, it's almost the start of the process, was starting your evaluation. So when that happened, um, I know that you probably were told there's going to be a lot of testing and a lot of things that you were going to go through. And when the process starts for a donor, there's certain things that have to be evaluated first. And one is that donors must be over the age of 18 and overall good medical health. And what is interesting and important to remember is that the donor's risk is completely separate, unique to any recipient. So the donor goes through the evaluation with respect of it's their life, their health, their long-term health that has to be in focus. And throughout the process, the donor is going to be informed of their risk. They're going to talk about, what the process is like for them, with the intent that there's to be no harm to the donor and that they are the number one priority through this. So, Susan, take us through what it was like for you in terms of, the evaluation and how that process worked for you.
Sure. So in that phone call with the transplant coordinator, she did send me a packet of information that was fairly exhaustive in terms of health history and just some demographics about me. The first 2 to 4 weeks of the evaluation for me were largely physical tests. So blood tests, I did a couple 24-hour urines, I had an EKG, I had an x-ray, just really exhaustively exploring my risk for being a donor. And through it all, I have to tell you, and I know we're going to talk about the team, I really felt like my health, what this was going to be like for me, was of paramount concern to my team. But this took probably 2 to 4 weeks to get all of it done. The last one was a CT with angio, and they were really great at my transplant center. They did it in the morning at my lunch break. They made it completely convenient for me to get all of these things done.
That's great. Now, you also had a couple extra tests. You had a stress test and so forth.
Yes, I did. I had a stress echo. Yeah.
All right.
Because I'm over 50.
So a couple weeks to get the testing done. Mm-hmm. And then let's talk about that transplant team. So the donor has a unique team that's dedicated just to the donor. You've got a transplant coordinator who's a nurse. And, you've heard Susan say, this nurse was the first person that she connected with. They build this relationship. They build this sense of trust. And then you also have a transplant nephrologist, a transplant surgeon, who are dedicated just to the donor to take them through this process, through the evaluation, through the surgery, and then even beyond. So Susan, do you want to talk about the other members of your team as well?
Sure. Certainly, yes. The transplant coordinator became my point person throughout the entire process. I could call her for any need that I had. But I did also meet with the surgeon, just to talk about the surgical issues. The dietitian met with me to discuss how my diet might change, the importance of continuing, healthy eating habits after I donated my kidney. I did meet with the social worker, and my husband was required to come to that visit. They want to meet with your caregiver who is going to be there for you when you are done and you're in your post-op period. The final person I met with was my donor advocate. And so he is a medical physician here in Charlotte who's unrelated to transplant. His role was to be my advocate, to make sure that I was getting everything that I needed, that I wasn't coerced in any way, that there was no pressure put on me. And from a health perspective, that they were covering all the bases to make sure that I would be okay.
Excellent. And it sounds like they took really good care of you. So
they did. They really did. At every single meeting, and I'm not exaggerating, everybody said to me, you don't have to do this. You can walk away at any time. There's no judgment. You are free to do what you choose to do. If you walk away the day of surgery, there is no harm. We will support you 100%. So I had no doubt that everything that they were doing was about me and to make sure that I was okay and that I was important, that I could, in fact, walk away. And I felt very sure that if I wanted to, I could have. Yes.
That's great. And as Susan mentioned, one of those final tests that's done is a CT scan or an angiogram, and in this case, the donors, they're receiving contrast, and again, prior to that test, they're offered the ability to walk away. But knowing that when we get to the point of doing the CT scan, there is a chance that based on anatomy, based on the size, the function of the kidneys, that that could be a turning point that we rule someone out. Because again, we want to make sure that from a transplant donation perspective, that we're leaving that donor with their best kidney. So again, looking at that CT scan and right, prior to surgery, having the recipient team look at that CT scan, making sure that we're choosing the correct kidney. So we've done all the tests, and now it's time to take that next step. So the next step is that we're going to take all the information that has been collected, all the tests, all the reports, all the meetings, the consultations, and we're going to present the donor's case before the entire transplant team. And again, when that donor is a potential donor is presented, they're presented in their own unique way, in no relation to who they would be potentially donating to, so that we can keep the focus of the donor's health completely as the priority. Now, for you, Susan, I think that the time frame was interesting here, because you had a couple weeks of testing, and then you knew that you were getting presented to the team.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I was finished up on a Monday, and I knew they were presenting me on Tuesday. And then I heard Wednesday, this was in October, and got the word that they had accepted me as a donor. And the next step would be my transplant coordinator. She said that they would flip the switch. And because of my blood type, first and foremost, they felt fairly confident that I would match quickly, which is what happened in my case.
Wow, that's exciting. And so once the match was found, now if it's an intended recipient, then really the next step would be to schedule surgery. So again, if it's an intended recipient or if it's through a paired exchange, once you have that match, then it is to schedule surgery. Now, it's always going to default to the donor, whatever's convenient for them in terms of surgery dates and so forth. And so that surgery date is scheduled, and then pre-op testing begins. So again, making sure that nothing's changed, some of the compatibility testing is repeated, and just getting some of that final pre-surgical blood work testing, x-rays done, depending on also the time frame from the evaluation to the surgery. So surgery itself, that's exciting. That's an exciting day. And I always say it doesn't matter how many times I was in the OR, it was magical to me. The donor and the recipient operations are typically done fairly simultaneous. The donor goes back about 45 minutes before the recipient. The surgeons go ahead and get everything prepped with the donor up until the moment of actually removing the kidney. They wait to do that until we know that the recipient is completely stable. So in the case of a paired exchange, again, you've got multiple donors, multiple recipients that you've got to really coordinate to make sure that the timing of everything is synced. And why is that so important? So one, and I mentioned this earlier, is we want to minimize the cold ischemic time. And that's the time that the kidney itself goes without blood flow. So the time that the kidney goes from the donor until it's reperfused in the recipient. And the lower amount in terms of time of cold ischemic time, the more benefits the recipient will have in terms of long-term survival. And also we want to know that the recipient's stable. So we know that the effects of kidney disease on a patient, it could affect their vascular anatomy. And so we want to make sure that the recipient surgeon has deemed that recipient to be medically and surgically stable to accept that kidney. So it's really neat in that when all that is ready, the recipient surgeon will actually go into the donor operating room and physically accept the kidney from the donor surgery. So physically in their hand pass that kidney off. And again, every time I talk about it, I just get chills, and it's just exciting to think about life being truly passed from one to another. So the standard practice at most transplant centers is that of hand-assisted laparoscopic nephrectomy. And that you can see here on the screen is where the donor is going to have 2 to 3 small incisions near the umbilicus, and then the kidney is going to be removed via a central incision. Again, standard practice at most transplant centers. It really does allow for the donor to have a shorter hospital stay and allows them to have a quicker return to their normal activity. And Susan, you could probably, vouch for how the process worked for you and your recovery, actually.
Right. So there were 4 of us the day of surgery. There were 2 donors and 2 recipients, and they staggered us going in because we wanted to preserve everybody's privacy because we didn't know one another. So my husband and I were to arrive at 5:20, and it was funny because we were in line to check in, and there were probably 20 people in front of us. And so, of course, we're back there going, "Is that them? Is that them?" We hadn't met, and I certainly wanted to, but it was just funny. So they put my husband in a private waiting room again to keep him separate from everybody else, and they took me back to pre-op. I was wheeled to the OR at 7 in the morning on a Wednesday. And cut time was about 8:15. And I went through PACU, spent about an hour in PACU, but I was in my room up on the 7th floor at Atrium Health at about noon. I was able to begin to eat a little bit that night, and very, very, very briefly was able to sit at the edge of the bed. But I very much wanted to go home on Friday. So I was motivated the following day to really get up and get to a chair. And I walked those halls just as much as I needed to. So I was able to be discharged on Friday.
Wow, that's great. That's, I think when we look at the potential risk and or complications for the donors, it's low. It's not zero, but it's really low. But, when we think about how can we ensure that we try to prevent, any short-term complications or long-term complications from occurring, we have to think about what are those risks. And it could be blood clots, it could be pneumonia. Donors are going to have a Foley catheter in place, so UTIs, an ileus. Again, we're having major abdominal surgery. And one of the more common things that a lot of laparoscopic patients complain of is some referred shoulder pain. And that is thought to be possibly due to some irritation of the phrenic nerve during the actual procedure itself. And another thing that is really important, especially in those initial days, hours, days, weeks after donation, is meticulous I's and O's, because we know that the donors just lost 50% of their kidney function. So we want to make sure that they're staying hydrated and that we're reinforcing hydration. Another thing that we have to watch closely is to see where their BUN and their creatinine levels are. So we expect, again, because they've lost 50% of their kidney function, we know that those levels are going to rise in that first couple of days. We anticipate it's going to peak at about that 7 to 14 day mark and then begin to trend back down. And when they get to about 6 months post-op, that's when they begin to see what their new normal is going to be like. And Susan, for you, you went through some post-op tests, some labs. I'm sure that you were educated on things to avoid and really how to go through that post-op course for ultimate success.
Absolutely. Certainly, no lifting was a big piece of that. I was really kind of down for, I returned to work at about 3.5 weeks, but it was serious recovery. So really just no lifting was the biggest one, but I could kind of do what I felt like doing. I did have a little bump in the road at about 2 weeks. They believed that I had just a small ileus. And so I really did struggle to keep food down for a few days. So I did go back in overnight, just overnight. They gave me some IV fluids and some medication, and I was just bounced back from that very, very quickly. But other than that, my My recovery was pretty uneventful. Like I said, I went back to work in about 3.5 weeks, which was, I tend to be a little, I like to work. So staying down was not easy for me. It's funny because going into it, I had told the surgeon that I thought, 2 weeks or 2.5 weeks. And I just remember him kind of laughing at me. And after the surgery, I thought, okay, I understand. I was doing half time at 3.5, 4 weeks and really back to full time about 5 or 6 weeks.
Wow.
But really uneventful.
That's great to hear. That's great to hear. Now, I'm sure that, when you think about long-term outcomes for the donor, I mean, there's a lot of what ifs that could be asked. But I think that really, when we think about it, the key to a positive outcome is really directly related to the donor selection process and making sure that that the transplant center is choosing a donor that is, both physically and mentally prepared for all of the what ifs that may happen. And, there have been a small number of donors that have unfortunately progressed to some kidney issues. One nice thing to know is that if a past living donor ever needs a kidney, that they can go right up to the top of the waiting list. So, when we think about any ethical concerns or the ability to withdraw from the process, I think that's huge. And, for you, Susan, confidentiality, I think, was big, especially the fact that you were going into this not knowing who your intended recipient was.
Right. And, some of the early questions that my team asked me to sort of contemplate were, what if you never get to meet them? I needed to be okay with that. Or, what if it doesn't work? How would that feel? So, I went into this knowing that this was a gift freely given, and I hoped that they would want to know me, but if they didn't, that was okay too. So it's really important, I think, during the evaluation process that all of those things be talked about.
Absolutely. And so we know that living donors are truly heroes. And to me, it's been great that we've been able to talk about this and to hear your journey. And, we want to make sure that there's others out there that that know about kidney donation. They know that is an option, and that they know that living organ donors really do save lives, and that this is one of my favorite quotes from Winston Churchill that says, for all of us as humans, we make a living by what we get, but we also make a life by what we give. And Susan, you've given the ultimate gift of life. And where you talked, I know when we talked before, you had said you wanted to not just to give to one person, but how many people could your gift affect? And indeed, you affected 2 families, and because you had 2 people that received a kidney because you gave that gift. So I want to leave us with you talking a little bit about what it was like for you, and then see if we have any questions out there.
Right. Well, so the plan originally was for us to, if she wanted to, my recipient, for us to meet at about the 6-week mark. That was the hope. But while I was still in the hospital, my transplant coordinator came in and asked me if I would be willing to meet on day 6, which of course I was. My recipient's sister was a college student who needed to go home at 10 days post-op. She needed to go back to New York. And so they all wanted to meet before she left. So I was absolutely okay with that. That for me was a gift. So on the 6th day, we all 4 of us, so the 2 donors and the 2 recipients, we met at the transplant center. And it was just a lovely moment. It was surreal to look into her eyes, this perfect stranger, and to know that, the kidney that had served me all of my life was now in her, and just making her life better. And it was just a great, great moment of tears and instant love for one another. It was really wonderful. And, I asked her if she had questions, and her only question for me was why. And I understood where that was coming from, but I'm just thankful we had the moment to talk about it, that I could share with her sort of what my journey was. And I think she was afraid that I would back out because I didn't have, I didn't have family in this mix. I only wish that I could have known her a little bit before, so I could have spared her the worry, because there was never a moment that I was going to back out.
Wow.
I was pretty sure there was no ambiguity about this decision for me. So
That's incredible. And this is the picture from that moment when you guys met 6 days post-op.
Yes.
That's incredible. That's incredible.
Yes.
So
it was just a life-changing experience.
Really is loving, and it's great that you were able to do that. And I think that we want to be able to get out there and talk about this as much as we can, because there are others out there that maybe they've never thought of being a kidney donor. Maybe they didn't know that they could.
Right.
So how can we educate them? We want to break that barrier down, and we really want to be able to offer them the ability to give someone that gift of life. So thank you, Susan, so much for sharing your journey with us, and thank you all
so much
for attending our session.
Thank you, everyone.